Learn about the brand new DALL-E API and how you can use it to generate unique images in your SwiftUI apps. This video does not have a sponsor. If you like my work or learn something from my videos, please consider subscribing. And if you're an indie developer working on your own projects, I suggest checking out Launchbody on the Mac App Store. It's a free project management tool that I developed myself. So this is the DALL-E 2 website, and you've probably already seen this because it's an AI system that can create realistic images and art from a description in natural language. That's how they put it here in their own description. And here you can see some examples on the website where we can pick, for example, teddy bears mixing sparkling chemicals as mad scientists in a steampunk style. And here on the right hand side you can then see an example of what's been generated. And since this is an AI, each time that you input the same prompt string, it actually produces different output images. So as you can see here, a ton of different images were generated as examples, all of them based on the exact same input string. Now, as of a few days ago, DALL-E actually has an open API that anyone can use. You can sign up for that on beta.openai.com. You can create your free account, and as it stands right now, you will get about $18 worth of credit. Generating one image should cost you about 2 cents currently. So that's plenty of room for you to play around with the API and perhaps even start building a product with it. The API is also very nicely documented here in beta.openai.com/overview. There are some example code snippets and so on, but I like to just go into the API reference, go into images, and then to the create image endpoint, and this is the most important one that we will cover today. We will also cover moderation, since OpenAI actually has a content policy, so all of these different categories are not allowed, and they have an endpoint to filter out potentially harmful content that they don't want to have using their API. So we will be using these two endpoints to make sure that the input string and user inputs into your app is valid within the content policy, and then this second API to generate an image given the input string. So let's get right to it. I've already created an empty Xcode project. We will start by working on the UI. It will not be fancy whatsoever. It will just get the job done. So first of all, let's get rid of this image and this text here. And the first thing we need obviously is a text field where the user can enter their input string. So let's call this enter prompt, and let's create a state variable. I will just call this prompt. It's a string, and of course it will be empty in the beginning, and then we can just bind to that prompt here in our text field. Now I use Xcode 14.1, so I have access to the iOS 16 API, so I can use this brand new axis parameter to make sure that the text field grows vertically the more the user types in it. So let me type a bunch of jazz here, and you will see that the text field grows vertically. Okay, this is not needed whatsoever for the app to work. I just like to add that so it's a bit easier for the user to have an overview of what they typed in. And then let's also add a text field style, and I will just go for rounded border just so it's very obvious for the user to see what the text field is. And once again, let's just enter something and you will see it will grow vertically, but keep the rounded border style. Okay, so that's the first part. Then of course we need a button to generate the images. So let's call this button generate, and in here we will be calling basically a service class that will then generate the image for us. I will actually make this VStack, give it an alignment of leading. I think that looks a little bit nicer, and also give this button a button style of bordered prominent. That way the user definitely knows what they have to do here. And then below that, we will then show the generated image once it's ready. And while it's not ready, we will just show a placeholder and perhaps a progress view. So for that, let's just add a rectangle. Let's fill it with color.blue, for example, so you can do really anything here that you want. And let's give it a frame with a width and a height. And let's do 256 by 256. Why is that relevant? If we go back to the API documentation, you can see that you have to specify the size of the image that's getting generated, and it can be either 256, 512, or 1024 by 1024 pixels, so it's always a square. We will just go for the largest one when we save it to the user's device, but to display it, we'll just go for 256. That should be big enough, I would say. And then let's also add an overlay here with a little VStack that just has a progress view and a text saying loading. Okay, nothing fancy, but once again, just to get the job done. Okay, so next you should now create a new file, and we will call that the DALL-E image generator. This is basically our service class. So a new Swift file. I will call it DALL-E image generator. I'll also copy that since we'll need it in a second. So first of all, let's import SwiftUI. Let's create a class with that same name. And let's create a shared instance for that, since there's really no need to have multiple instances of the service. So let's say static let shared equals just this thing. And then let's also make sure nobody else can create more instances by making the initializer private. This is basically the singleton pattern. A lot of people don't like it. I think it's fine for simple applications like this. But of course, you can go your own route, learn about dependency injection, use that approach here. I've also have a tutorial on that, so you can have a look around on my channel. But without further ado, let's now get into the API usage. For that, let's go back to the documentation. First, we will have a look at the moderation API. So this is a quick start guide showing us that it's basically a post request to this URL with the content type, with our OpenAPI key or OpenAI API key, and then with our input string as the body of the request. And then we will get back an object like this one here, where we can in the end see whether it got flagged or not. Okay, so let's get right to it. Let's create a function called hit moderation endpoint. This one will take in a prompt, which is a string, and an API key, which is also a string. We will use Swift concurrency for this tutorial. So this function will be asynchronous. It can also throw errors, and it will return a boolean. And let's actually rename it to make sure prompt is valid. I think that makes a bit more sense, given that it returns a boolean whether it's valid or not. Okay, so first of all, let's go back to the documentation and copy this URL string. So we can start to create a URL from a string here. If that fails, we will just return false. You can of course create your own error type and throw errors here. I think returning false is fine in this tutorial. You saw that we will have to pass one parameter, which is the input string, into our request's body. So let's say let parameters be a dictionary of string to any, and let's initialize it to be input is our prompt. So this is all of the parameters that we will pass. Very simple for this API. Let's make sure to convert this dictionary into a data object. So let's say let data, which will be a data object, equals try JSON serialization dot data with this JSON object, so our parameters. So now we converted our dictionary of values into a data object. Next, let's create our URL request. So let's say var request equal a URL request given our URL, and now we can add some values to this request. So these are basically these headers here. So for application/JSON, or we will add application/JSON for the field content type. Let me copy this line real quick, just so we don't have to type it out 2 times. Then we will add our bearer token, which is our API key. For the authorization header, authorization like that. Then we'll make sure that the HTTP method is post, as that's what's specified here in the documentation. And then we'll also add our HTTP body. So request.http body is our data. Okay, so now we can fire this request and interpret the results. For that, I have already prepared a moderation response type. So let me quickly copy that one over. So let's create a new file called moderation response. And in here, let me just quickly paste this thing. What I've done is I've taken this example response, used a tool called DallE. I already have plenty of other videos showing how it works, so I'm just skipping it for now. DallE just converts a JSON response to a SwiftUI, to a Swift type. So that's what I've done here. And then I've also added this computed variable here called hasIssues, which is a Boolean. And it just takes all of the results, so all of the different categories basically, maps them to whether they are flagged. And then if one of them was flagged, this response basically returned that it has issues. So very simple stuff here. So next, let's fire up the URL request. So let result, and we don't really care about the HTTP result, equals try await URL session dot shared dot data, not from, because we're not getting the data from a URL. We have already created a URL request, so we'll use the data for our request method here. And let me actually call this one response, and then we can say let result equal try our JSON decoder dot decode this type that we just added, so moderation response dot self from our response here. And then in the end, as you remember, we return a Boolean here to make sure that the prompt is valid. So we will return result dot has issues. This would be the exact opposite of what we want to return, so we will make sure that it's false. Of course, you can also just add an exclamation point in front. I like to be a bit more specific. I think the exclamation mark is just too small, and sometimes I miss it when reading through the code. So I've started to add this equals false here to the end, but you can do whatever style you like, of course. Okay, so right now we can hit this endpoint and make sure that the prompt is valid. So let's next create a function to actually generate an image from our given input string. So I will just call it generate image with a prompt, which is internally called prompt, and it's just a string, and an API key, which is also a string. This is also an async func, and it throws. And this one returns, let's have a quick look at the documentation again. So let's go to images. You will see the response will look like this. So it will have a timestamp of when it was created, and then a data object containing a list of URLs. So once again, I have already prepared the response here for us to just copy paste. So let's create a new file. Let's call it image generation response. And let's paste that thing in here. So yeah, as I said, just a timestamp of when it was created, an array of URLs. Very simple stuff. So this is the type that will be returned by this function. Okay, so first of all, we gotta make sure that the prompt is valid, which is the function that we just wrote up here. So let's say guard try await, make sure prompt is valid, pass in the prompt and the API key. If it's not valid, we will throw an error. So here it probably makes sense to create our own error type. So I will just do that in the same file here. I just call it image error. This of course has to conform to error, and let's just add the case of invalid prompt. So let's throw an image error of invalid prompt, and let's actually do the nice thing and update our make sure prompt is valid function as well. And instead of returning false here, you can also just throw an image error dot bad URL perhaps. So let's create that case here as well. Okay, so now that we made sure that the prompt is valid, we can create our URL once again. So let's say guard let URL equals a URL from a string. Going back to the documentation once again, this is the URL that we need. So let's copy that over. Let's paste it in here. If that fails, we can once again throw an image error dot bad URL. Now, the rest of this function here is very similar to what we did before. So we will once again create a set of parameters, which is a dictionary of string to any. The first string is the prompt, which is of course our prompt. Second value is just called n, I think because this API was designed to be used with Python and not with Swift, where variable names are usually more descriptive than just an n. This means how many images you want to generate. We will just generate one, but you can pass in any number here and then you will get a list of URLs back. In our case, we will just use one URL. But once again, go ham here, create multiple images, whatever makes sense for you. Next, we have to pass in the size of the image that we want. So let's say we want the biggest possible size. And then we can also, now this is not very relevant for testing, but if you want to publish this app, OpenAI actually needs you to pass in a user ID. Now what you can do is pass in a session ID. So that's what I will do. So let's say let session ID is a UUID and we take that string. And now we can just pass in for the user parameter our session ID. Once again, not relevant for testing, but once you plan to go live with this app, you definitely need to pass in a user or session ID here. Okay, so let's then also use JSON serialization, same as before, to create a data from our parameters, a data object. Let's be explicit here as well. Next, let's create our URLRequest, and actually for that I will mostly copy it over from beforehand, since it is very similar. And actually it's exactly the same URL request, now that I think about it. Getting the response and the result is also pretty much the same, so let's also copy that over. Except that we don't want a moderation response, we of course want an image generation response.self, and then we can just return that result in the end. So quickly going over it again, we make sure that the prompt is valid using the moderations endpoint. Then we create our URL using the generations endpoint. We add a bunch of parameters for our HTTP body using JSON serialization from our dictionary. We add values for the content type, the authorization header, and we make sure that the HTTP method is post, of course. This is already everything in our DALL-E image generator class. So now we can pretty much go back to content view, and in our button we can say image, or it was called DALL-E image generator.shared.generate image. Now this is grayed out because it's async and it throws. So let's embed this into a task, and let's also embed this into a do catch block. And we will just print out the error here for the sake of this tutorial. Of course, in your real app, you will probably want to display it to the user somehow. And here we will say let response equals try await this function call. The prompt is of course our prompt string, and the API key is your API key from the beta.openai.com website. So you can just put that in here or hard code it somewhere else in your app. What I will do is go and create a new file. I will call it secret. And in here, I will just create an API key and put my API key in here. And actually, let's embed that into an enum called secrets, and let's say static let API key. Okay. And then in content view, we can just remove this string here and say secrets.api key. Now I can safely add my key to the secret file, and you can add yours as well, and you will not see mine in the video. Okay, so now that we have this response here, we can start to interpret it and basically convert it to an image that we can then display to the user in the app. So let's first of all make sure that we did get back a URL. So if let URL equals response.data.map to the URL parameter, and then let's grab the first one of that array. So if we did get back a URL from the API, we can then do another URL request or URL session request to get the data from that URL and then convert that to a UI image and then convert that to a SwiftUI image. So a few more steps, but it's actually very simple. We have already done most of the work here. So let's say let data, and we don't care about the response, equals try await URL session. You know how it works, .share.data. In this case, we're not sending a request. We're just using a simple URL. So we can say data from URL. And now let's add a state variable. Let's call it image. This will be a UI image. And in the beginning, it will of course be nil because we haven't loaded anything yet. So now we can say image equal a UI image from data, which is the one that we just downloaded from the URL that we got. Let's also add another state variable saying is loading. That is a bool. Of course, we're not loading at the beginning. And then here we can say is loading is false. And before we send the request, let's say is loading equals true. Now we can only show this little progress view here if is loading is true. So in the beginning, it will not be showing. Once we hit the generate button, it will be showing. Once we got an image back, it will not be showing anymore. Okay, and then let's also show the image that we generated. So let's say if let image. This is a little shorthand syntax that got added with Swift 5.7, I believe. Very nice little syntax here. So if we have a UI image, we can display a SwiftUI image. Given a UI image, we can make it resizable, we can make it scale to fit, and we can give it the exact same frame as our rectangle had. That way it just nicely replaces this rectangle here. And then if we don't have an image, we will just show the rectangle instead, just like that. Okay, so let's try it out. I'm actually not sure if it works in the preview or just in the simulator, but first of all, I will have to add my API key in the secrets file. Okay, so I added the API key and let's try this out. So let's enter a prompt of saying a cute monkey eating an apple while sitting in a tree as a comic. So let's press generate. You will see that it starts to load, and this API is rather slow compared to some of the other APIs you might have previously used. So let's give this a few seconds. And then you can see here the monkey eating an image, eating an apple, sitting in a tree got generated as a comic image. I think this one looks very, very nice actually. Okay, last part of this tutorial, and I think then we're done, is to actually save this image to use this image directory. So what we can do, for example, is create a button and just call it save image. And then there's a very weird, super old Objective-C UIKit API here, and that's called UI image write to saved photos album. We can pass in an image here, and then we can pass in nil for all of this other stuff. In order for this to work, we need to actually add a plist entry. So let's go to our Xcode project. Let's go to info. Let's hit the little plus and scroll down to the privacy section. So let's see, privacy, photo library additions usage description. And let's just say needed to save your generated images. Now with that done, let's actually run it in the simulator. Okay, so the app has now loaded in the simulator. Let's enter a prompt here. So this time, what should we do? You can be very creative here. So I might try out programmer wearing a tank top, sitting on a beach with their laptop under the sun. So this might get interesting here. And let's say as a comic once again. I like that as a comic part. I think it just really looks nice. So let's hit generate. The API is loading, should take a few seconds, same as before, and then we will hopefully see a very nice image. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel so you can keep on learning about iOS development through my future uploads. You can also like this video and let me down in a comment down below. Let me know how you like the API and how you plan to use it. Okay, so this is very interesting. It looks like he has 3 arms, so 1 right here and 2 back here, and I'm kind of missing the tank top, but other than that, the API got it right. So let's hit save image. It will ask us if we would like to give the permission. Let's say okay. And now we can go to the home screen, to the Photos app. I know I don't want any notifications. And you will see that the image got saved there. It's 1024 by 1024 pixels, so big enough to use as a profile picture or whatever on your socials. Okay, so that's it for this quick tutorial. I really enjoy using this API. I wish you a lot of fun playing around with it, and be sure to let me know either in the comments or on Twitter what you create using the knowledge that you just gained in this video. So, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.